Last night and this morning, I sat down and did a reread of Hugh MacLennan's Return of the Sphinx, which was first published in 1967, Canada's centennial year, and it was not well received at the time. I think it hit too close to home. At least that's what the writer of the introduction of this McGill Queen's University Press supposes. The criticisms aimed at the book were against its content, but also against its writing style. However, elsewhere in the world, in the United States, it received fairly well. It was received fairly well. The reviews were good. The writing style was praised, but for whatever reason in Canada, it was not well liked. Return of the Sphinx is somewhat thematically pessimistic sequel of his earlier novel from 1945, Two Solitudes. I first read this novel in April of 2015. It is now May of 2016, and last night I just picked it up and I read through it and finished it this morning. The opening line of Return of the Sphinx is probably my favorite opening line of any novel ever. Not just in Canadian literature, in any country's literature. It begins, "The land defied everyone's idea of what a land ought to be. Just the land by being where it was, what it was, and how it was." If anything that defines the beginnings of Canadian literature, a large piece of the Canadian identity and what Canadian literature has been and continues to be. At the same time, though, the land represents the country in a way. Quebec, perhaps. Let's rephrase this line. Quebec defied everyone's idea of what Quebec ought to be. Just Quebec by being where it was, what it was, and how it was. Or change that again. Canada defied everyone's idea of what land ought to be. Just Canada by being where it was, what it was, and how it was. Rereading this novel, I found the sequence in which Hugh MacLennan introduces topics and themes very interesting. We start with land, with a classic trope of Canadian literature. You begin with the land, everything comes back to the land. But then he introduces war. The First and Second World War, which throughout all of Hugh MacLennan's novels, the wars are kind of preoccupation for him. He never quite gets over them or past them, which I guess you can't really expect him to, considering the time period in which he lived and which he wrote. But we go from land to war to what would have been contemporary politics at the time, but it's not just politics. He transitions to fear. Return of the Sphinx and MacLennan's writing later in life, from the late 60s to when he published his last novel in 1980, Voices in Time. It seems to be about fear. We no longer have the optimistic MacLennan of earlier years. We have an author who is genuinely concerned and fearful about the direction that his country is headed in. There's a passage in this novel where one of the characters admits that another character has a sort of mystique or a mysticism about Canada as a country, and he admits that as a flaw. And as I read that, it occurred to me that this is indeed the same mystique about Canada that MacLennan himself held in his lifetime. At least that's the way it appeared through his writing. And so I can't help but wonder if this novel was a turning point for him, where he indeed realized that he was holding on to a myth, and although he was holding on to a myth, he still believed that that myth it represented something worth keeping. And so this novel is kind of a warning about the potential breakup of the country, I guess politically, but also the breakdown of, I guess, politics and society in the country as a whole and globally. I guess what you need to keep in mind when reading Return of the Sphinx is that Hugh MacLennan, this is an author who has devoted his literary career to explaining Canada to Canadians, to defining what Canadian literature is. And then all of a sudden he gets to this turning point in the 1960s where society is changing rapidly, Canada is changing rapidly. You have the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. Separatism is really taking off, and he realizes that this idea of Canada, this Canadian literature that he has worked so hard to build, is falling apart. Canada is at risk of literally breaking apart. The first time I read Return of the Sphinx, a little over a year ago, I read it as basically a fun novel. I read it for the entertainment factor. I read it so that I could get through Hugh MacLennan's body of literature, and I really enjoyed it at the time. I remember giving it 5 stars. I remember feeling very sad about the ending, though. I didn't like MacLennan's portrayal of the separatist movement. In the past year, my views have changed, and I am actually very contented with the way this novel ends. Return of the Sphinx was published in the 1960s. The 1960s in Canada were much the same as the 1960s elsewhere. In the United States especially, you had intergenerational conflict that is very present, very prevalent in this novel. You had kind of a tension between father and son, definitely a key factor in this novel. Interestingly, what MacLennan seems to be getting at are the moments when the two generations come together and understand each other. Those are the key moments. Those are positive highlights in Return of the Sphinx. When they get together, that's when they are able to weather the storms, so to speak. One of the things that I really noticed in this novel is MacLennan's belief that history is cyclical. There's members from both generations tying in the 1960s happenings in Quebec to previous historical events. The older generation does it somewhat cynically. They say this is just like the 1930s, and with the communist movement here in Quebec, it's going to end the same way. They say this is just like what happened in Germany. This is just like this is just what we've already been through. We have been through this before. Whereas many members of the younger generation, they compare it to previous revolutions. They feel as if they're on the cusp of a big movement, of an independence movement, and they believe it's actually going to happen this time. MacLennan really latches onto this idea of a universal, reoccurring phenomena. This upheaval, this tension has happened elsewhere. It's happened before. The return of the Sphinx, it's a reoccurring curse. It occurs again and again throughout history, and this incident in the 1960s is only its latest occurrence. What I was surprised by when rereading this was the extremes that some of the characters take the comparisons to. Comparisons to France right before the French Revolution. There's this odd kind of electricity or tension in the air that many of the characters notice. One of the characters voices a concern that if civil war were to occur in Quebec within 48 hours, you would have the American military in there. And Quebec herself would become just another portfolio on the desk of foreign affairs, grouped in with Latin American countries. Today it seems like a very extreme view, and I can't comment for sure because I wasn't there in the 1960s. But from what I read of left-wing literature, there were many people who actually believed that the separatist movement in Quebec was part of a larger global movement. Many Quebecois felt themselves allied with revolutionaries in Latin America. They felt themselves allied with the civil rights movement in the United States. They felt themselves allied with movements in Europe. Now it certainly seems that Hugh MacLennan was overreacting when he had these fears that Canada would break apart. Canada would end up in civil war, but perhaps at the time it wasn't quite so far-fetched. I mean, the FLQ, the Front de Libération de Québec, was blowing up mailboxes. In 1970, they kidnapped a cabinet minister. There was a time when perhaps MacLennan's fears were not so far-fetched. And even in his later writing, this fear is something that he never seems to have quite gotten over. These themes of fear, of the breakup of the country, of Canada really self-destructing, appear in his later novel from 1980, Voices in Time. So to the plot of the novel itself, this isn't really a novel with a lot of action. Most of what occurs takes place in memories and conversations in the inner thoughts of characters. Its actual span is only over, it seems to be, a couple of days in the heat of summer. You get the sense that this is a very hot, sticky, almost smoldering city just baking in the heat. I guess that kind of adds to the atmosphere of things are heating up and the revolution could occur at any moment. We have Alan Ainsley, the father of two children who are also our main characters, and he is a Federalist, and he is also a high-ranking government official. Because of his own politics and because of his son's politics, he ends up locked in a kind of tension with other members of his party. He finds it increasingly difficult to toe the party line, and he's concerned that he will soon be asked to resign. Then we have Alan's son, Daniel, who is a self-proclaimed separatist. He is working on a government-run TV show, but he's using it as an outlet to basically air scripted interviews with French separatists. He truly believes that the independence movement will occur any moment, that the revolution will begin. He's willing to sacrifice his education, his family, his future really, all for the sake of this movement. But he's also acknowledged that chances are this won't happen peacefully. He's willing to take part in a violent civil war for the sake of the freedom of his people, his cultural group. And not only is he willing to take part in this civil war, but he's willing to be one of the people who drop the match that sparks the movement. Then we have Alan's daughter and Daniel's sister, Chantal, and she's kind of the bridge between the two generations. She really just wants kind of a peaceful place to live. She's trying to deal with her brother, deal with her father. Ultimately, though, she seems to choose the generation before hers. She chooses the author's generation. She chooses Hugh MacLennan's generation. Instead of reading a passage from the novel like I normally would, I'm going to read a portion of the introduction written by Colette Tracy. So this is a bit of historical background to the novel and to what was going on at the time in Quebec. In Montreal in particular, a new atmosphere was developing. In 1960, the Quebec Liberal Party, led by Jean Lesage, began to implement massive changes that heralded what has since been called the Quiet Revolution. The previous government, run by Maurice Duplessis, had promoted conservatism and protected the iron grip of the Catholic Church on public and social services, including schools, hospitals, orphanages, and the media. These controls demanded and reinforced respect for order, authority, and the law. Duplessis had also continued to provide special benefits to agriculture, which was a major component of Quebec's economy during the early part of the 20th century, thus guaranteeing the Conservative Party's popularity and ongoing power. At the same time, the Conservatives were committed to private enterprise, balanced budgets, and support for foreign business. While these priorities were popular, they had kept Quebec far behind the rest of North American society in terms of modernization. It was these issues the Quebec Liberal Party, and through it the leaders of the Quiet Revolution, sought to address. The Second World War was the primary instigation for the changes that took place in the middle part of the century. When it was over, democracies had overthrown authoritarian regimes such as fascism and Nazism, and replaced them with governments that reflected a new sense of liberalism, reinforcing ideas of individualism and liberty. As the rate of industrialization continued to accelerate, people moved to cities in increasing numbers. This was particularly true in Quebec, and the province shifted quickly from a primarily agrarian economy to an urban industrial one. With so many people abandoning not only their rural origins, but also their communal and Catholic ties, and with women joining the workforce and influencing the expansion of social services, including schools, the entire social fabric of Quebec was rewoven. It was during this time that a group of intellectuals, that included Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the former Prime Minister, from 1968, with a brief period of time off right up into the 1980s, but Jacques Herbert and Claude Ryan came together to offer a new vision for the province. While they continued to support the Catholic Church, they rejected its control of public institutions, education, and social services, preferring instead to promote the importance of the individual in society. While this shift was taking place in Quebec, a new and different sense of nationalism was growing in Canada as a whole, one that acknowledged the individual importance of the provinces and their governments. Quebec's ongoing battle to have its language and culture recognized across Canada was an important element of this change. With the abolition of French Catholic schools in the western provinces during the 1920s and increased awareness of the lack of minority francophone rights in much of Canada, more and more people began to feel that Quebec was the only place francophones could feel at home. Given the increasing sense of the French language and culture needed protection, more and more francophones felt drawn to Quebec and towards autonomy. This is the national context in which MacLennan found himself in the early 1960s, when he began to write Return of the Sphinx. So he would have been in his 50s when he wrote this, so I think you can easily understand his somewhat reactionary, fearful response to change. And I think I lied, because I can't end this video without reading you a passage from the actual novel. Let's see if I can find a good one. Okay, here we go, page 10. It's all very peculiar. I know quite a few French Canadians, and like them. I always have. They can't accuse me of not speaking their language either, but they're too suspicious. Their priests teach them to complain from the cradle against the rest of us. Whatever goes wrong here, they're taught to blame it on us. Sometimes I think if we turn the whole country over to them, they complain because we hadn't left them with anything more to complain about. Tarnley went on in the tone of a puzzled man thinking aloud to himself. You see, in the past, this French-English thing was never personal. In the old days, whenever I came to Montreal, I used to look up one of their politicians whose stock and trade was French-Canadian nationalism. But that never made the slightest difference between us. I always considered him a good friend, and I knew he felt the same about me. But now it seems different. This time it seems to be personal. I'm beginning to think they really hate us now, and honestly I can't understand why they do. Am I right? Maybe I could answer for you if I knew what real hatred is. My men here aren't stupid, Tarnley went on, but none of them can tell me anything definite. One of them's an Englishman, very experienced. He speaks reasonable French, and up to now he's always liked the French better than the Canadian English. That's why I picked him for the job. Tarnley's forehead wrinkled. Well, this Englishman spent a lot of time in Kenya, and he told me only yesterday that the queer sensation he used to have in Africa was coming back to him. He told me he felt as though an invisible curtain had suddenly been drawn. On the surface, everything calm and normal. But now, nobody's told him this, mark you. Now he tells me he has the feeling that the French Canadians have all made up their mind about something. He feels he's being quietly watched. Well, Gabriel, how does that strike you? Gabriel smiled slightly. It strikes me that your Englishman's a very intelligent Englishman. He told me something else. I remember his exact words. Mr. Tarnley, he said, I haven't got a single shred of proof, but I can't help believing that this country's on the point of breaking up. So, Gabriel, is he being sensational, or is he on the right track? How would I know? Nothing here ever seems to turn out the way it does in other countries. That line kind of takes me back to the first line of the novel, how the land defied expectations of what a land ought to be. So once again, it's as if the land and Quebec are linked. Nothing turns out the way it ought to. The land is not what it ought to be. Everyone Gabriel met from the English-speaking provinces sooner or later asked him questions like these, and he would have answered them directly if he could. But he really did not know. One day he was sure of one thing, the day following of its direct opposite. The French Canadians were very different from the French of France, and over against them was the Anglo-Saxon attitude, which looked on life as a series of problems to be solved by intelligent management. Religion and their own peculiar history had made the French Canadians a people capable of tragedy, and yes, of the dignity of tragedy. Everyone knew of their previous isolation and how it had built into them a kind of tribal endurance. But now they were no longer isolated in their spirits, and the younger generation was finding itself lost and excited in a new world. But it was more than this, much more. What was happening here, or rather what he dreaded was going to happen, seemed to him a part of the mysterious emotion which was sweeping the world and causing crowds to break the windows of American embassies in country after country. "I saw that riot with my own eyes," Tarnley said. "They staged it right underneath our windows and interrupted a board meeting. I tell you, Gabriel, it was something entirely new in this country. It wasn't a strike. It didn't seem to be in favor of anything in particular. It was nothing more than an explosion of mass emotion, so far as I could see." That passage more or less sets the tone for the novel, and it's set in Canada, but as many readers discovered when it was first published in the 1960s in the United States, some of its themes are pretty universal. Certainly it's a snapshot into the past, into the 1960s, but at the same time as I was reading it, there were many moments when I said to myself, this moment, this scene, this idea is still very much relevant today. So I would encourage you to go and get yourself a copy of Return of the Sphinx by Hugh MacLennan and read some Canadian literature.